Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle a question that I think is fascinating, and that's what really makes a nation. And we're going to use India as our case study, using excerpts from a 1960s speech by Shrii Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar titled "To the Patriots" on nation formation in India.
Yeah, it's a fascinating speech.
And Gary,
it's pretty radical in some ways.
Yeah.
He really challenges those common assumptions we have about nationhood, like that it's all about shared language or religion or even race or traditions. He says all that is superficial. True nationhood, it runs deeper. It's bound by what he calls a unifying sentiment.
See, I love how Sarkar uses history as his, proving ground. So he points to, multilingual Switzerland thriving as a nation and contrasts it with, the partition of Bengal, where shared language didn't prevent division. Clearly, language alone isn't enough. What about religion? That seems like a pretty strong unifying force.
You would think, right.
Yeah.
But Sarkar uses Europe as a prime example. Largely Christian, but still divided into, all these distinct nations. And even in regions with shared religious traditions, like Jews and Muslims in Arabia, conflict persists. So religion's not a guarantee of national unity either.
Okay, so if it's not language or religion, what about race? Shared ancestry, blood ties? That seems pretty fundamental to a nation.
Well, Sarkar addresses that too. He points to the Iberian Peninsula and Scandinavia, racially homogenous but divided into separate nations.
Right.
So blood ties, while they might be a factor, they're not enough to forge a nation on their own.
Fascinating. So he's systematically debunking each like a pillar of nationhood. What about shared traditions? Those common cultural practices got to play a role, right?
Right. Well, Sarkar tackles that as well. He observes that people in Bengal and Punjab shared many traditions, yet they didn't form unified nations.
Right.
Even the Jews and Muslims in Arabia, with their shared traditions, we saw persistent conflict between them. So while traditions can contribute to a sense of shared identity, they don't automatically translate to national unity.
So if all these usual suspects are off the table, what is Sarkar's theory? What's the secret ingredient that binds a nation together?
He calls it sentiment. And he doesn't just mean a feeling. He means a shared aspiration, a common purpose that transcends those surface differences we just talked about.
Okay.
It's the lifeblood of a nation, he says.
That makes sense, but it's a bit abstract. Does he give us any concrete examples of this sentiment in action in Indian history?
Absolutely. He takes us on this journey through the rise and fall of various nations within India, showing how different sentiments fueled their formation and then also their eventual demise. It's like a historical drama full of twists and turns.
Okay, I'm hooked.
Yeah.
Take us back in time. What's the first chapter in this Indian saga of sentiments and nations?
Well, we start with the arrival of the Aryans in ancient India. They brought their Vedic lifestyle, their language, their social structures, and this created a distinction between themselves and the indigenous population, the non-Aryans.
So was it just a simple case of cultural dominance? The Aryans just imposing their ways on the existing inhabitants?
It's more nuanced than that.
Wow.
Sarkar highlights the sentiment of victory and superiority that the Aryans felt. A sense of being conquerors, like they were a distinct and superior group.
And what about the non-Aryans? How did they react to this new power dynamic?
They felt the opposite, a feeling of subjugation.
Right.
This sense of otherness created a divide. And so two distinct nations emerged, the Aryan and the non-Aryan, defined by these opposing sentiments.
Two nations within the same geographic space. Fascinating. What happened next? Did this division last?
Over time, things shifted. Racial blending between the two groups became common. The non-Aryans were eventually integrated into the Aryan social structure, although at the lowest caste, the Shudras.
So as they mingled, did those sentiment-based divisions just fade away?
Exactly. Those distinct Aryan and non-Aryan sentiments, they weakened as their cultural and social boundaries blurred. The two nations essentially dissolved, leaving India, in Sarkar's view, nationless once again.
Wow, so even a sentiment as strong as one based on conquest and subjugation can fade. What happened next in this cycle of nation formation and disintegration in India?
The next chapter takes us to a period of religious and social upheaval, the rise of Buddhism.
Ah, yes. Buddhism spreading across India. That must have dramatically impacted those existing sentiments.
It did. Sarkar argues that the Buddhist movement fostered a new unifying sentiment centered around its teachings and philosophy. This led to the formation of what he calls a Buddhist nation.
Did this Buddhist nation cover all of India, or were there other groups with different beliefs?
Initially, non-Buddhists were scattered. They lacked a unifying force.
Okay.
However, as Buddhism gained influence, some within the movement, in Sarkar's words, started acting unfairly towards those outside the fold.
So the very sentiment of unity among Buddhists kind of sparked an opposing sentiment.
Exactly. This mistreatment, often backed by the ruling authorities at the time, fostered resentment and a shared grievance among non-Buddhists. And so they began to unite under an anti-Buddhist sentiment. It's mirroring that earlier dynamic between the Aryans and non-Aryans.
It's incredible how these sentiments ebb and flow, shaping and reshaping the socio-political landscape. What led to the decline of this Buddhist nation? Was it simply this opposing sentiment gaining strength?
Sarkar points to a few things. He mentions internal issues within the Buddhist community itself, like declining moral standards among monks and a lack of strong leadership.
Okay.
He also highlights the rise of a powerful counter-movement led by the scholar Shankaracharya, who advocated for a revival of what he called the Sanatani, or Brahmanical religion.
So Shankaracharya tapped into that growing anti-Buddhist sentiment and channeled it into a new unifying force.
Precisely. He provided a rallying point, a shared ideology that helped those who felt marginalized by the Buddhist establishment. This led to the emergence of what Sarkar calls the Brahmanical nation, built, ironically, on an anti-Buddhist sentiment.
It's almost poetic how the very sentiment that brought down one nation became the foundation for another. Does this pattern continue? Do we see another swing of the pendulum in Indian history?
We do. And this is where external forces come into play, the arrival of the Muslim invaders.
Yes, a pivotal moment in Indian history. I'm curious how Sarkar ties this event into his theory of nation formation.
He emphasizes that the Muslim conquest wasn't immediate. Their early attempts, like the invasion of Sind in the 8th century, didn't lead to lasting control.
Right.
He argues that the Muslims only fully established their rule when India was nationless, after both the Buddhist and Brahmanical nations had dissolved due to their own internal contradictions and waning sentiments.
So a unified sentiment is crucial not just for a nation's birth, but also for its defense.
Absolutely. He sees that shared purpose and solidarity as key to resisting threats, both internal and external. Without it, a nation is vulnerable.
It makes you wonder how different Indian history might have been if a strong unifying sentiment had been present during those early Muslim incursions. What happened once the Muslims did establish their rule? Did they bring their own nation-forming sentiment?
They did. Sarkar describes how the Muslims arrived with their own distinct language, initially Turkish, later Persian, as well as their cultural practices, dress, and, of course, their Islamic faith. All these elements combined to create a new sentiment, the sentiment of a ruling class, a distinct Muslim nation within India.
This adds another layer to how nations form. It's not just internal dynamics, but also external influences, conquests, the imposition of new sentiments. What was the reaction of the existing population to this Muslim nation? Did they just accept their new rulers?
Not quite. Sarkar acknowledges that the Muslim rulers, like those before them, had their share of oppression and injustice.
Right.
This mistreatment, as you might expect, triggered a reaction among the non-Muslim population. They began to unite under a shared sentiment, an anti-Muslim sentiment, as a form of resistance and self-preservation.
It's amazing how this pattern repeats throughout history. A dominant group asserts itself, sparking an opposing sentiment among those they subjugate. A historical dance between power and resistance. So we have two distinct nations, again, the Muslim nation and, what does Sarkar call it, the Hindu nation. So we have these two distinct nations, again, the Muslim nation and, what did Sarkar call it, the Hindu nation. It feels like a simplification, given how diverse those groups are within themselves.
You're right to point that out. Sarkar calls it the Hindu nation, but he stresses that it wasn't homogenous. More like a loose coalition united primarily by their shared opposition to Muslim rule.
So their unifying sentiment was reactive, defining themselves against something, rather than a shared positive aspiration. Does that make it weaker?
Sarkar seems to suggest that. He points out how this reactive sentiment manifested in various ways. Hindus adopted practices diametrically opposed to those of the Muslims. For example, if Muslims didn't wear a particular garment during prayer, Hindus would make a point of wearing it. If Muslims favored certain foods, those became taboo for Hindus. It was about solidifying their identity through contrast.
It mirrors what happened with the Aryans and non-Aryans. But history shows us these rigid divisions rarely last. What happened to these two nations, the Muslim and the Hindu? Did they remain locked in this adversarial dynamic?
Like with the Aryan and non-Aryan dynamic, those lines blurred over time. The Muslims, unlike the later British, saw India as their home. They settled, interacted, and inevitably their cultures intertwined.
Did this cultural exchange weaken the distinct sentiments that define the Muslim and Hindu nations?
Exactly. Sarkar describes this fascinating process. The Muslims' Persian language blended with local languages to create new dialects like Urdu. This linguistic fusion became a bridge, facilitating communication and shared experiences.
Language is so powerful. It can divide, but also unite. What other examples of this cultural blending does Sarkar highlight?
He talks about Persian words enriching various Hindu languages, creating common ground. Muslim scholars study Sanskrit, the ancient language of Hindu scriptures, while Hindus learned Urdu and Persian. They even started adopting each other's styles of dress and using each other's titles.
Interesting.
Religious practices also saw them blending, with Hindus participating in certain Muslim traditions and vice versa.
It sounds like these two nations, once defined by opposition, were slowly weaving a new tapestry of shared culture. What overall impact did this blending have on their respective sentiments?
Sarkar argues that this cultural exchange, this gradual assimilation, significantly weakened both the Muslim and Hindu sentiments. That sense of stark difference of us versus them began to fade. The victor-vanquished relationship transformed into something more akin to, as he puts it, brothers and sisters.
So once again, those nation-defining sentiments dissolve, leaving India.
Nationless for the third time, according to Sarkar. And this was the backdrop against which the British entered the scene.
And unlike the Muslims, the British had a very different agenda in India.
Indeed. Sarkar emphasizes the British came purely for exploitation, to extract wealth and resources. They had no intention of making India their home or integrating into its society.
So how did this exploitative approach affect the sentiment landscape of India? Did it reinforce existing divisions or create something new?
It created something entirely new. Sarkar argues that British exploitation, ironically, became the catalyst for a pan-Indian sentiment, a sense of unity that had never existed before on such a scale.
That's a fascinating paradox.
Yeah.
How did the British, with their extractive policies, end up uniting the very people they were exploiting?
It was all about a common enemy. The British, with their blatant disregard for the well-being of the Indian people, became the focal point of shared grievance. People from different regions, languages, religions, and castes found common cause in their opposition to British rule.
It's a classic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. Did this shared anti-British sentiment manifest in any concrete ways? Did it lead to organized resistance movements?
Absolutely. But Sarkar points out a critical blunder by the Indian leaders during this period. They focused primarily on political independence, aiming to oust the British from power, but they neglected the fight for economic independence.
So they were so focused on getting the British OUT that they didn't address the underlying systems of economic exploitation, leaving themselves vulnerable even if they achieved political freedom.
Exactly. Sarkar argues this was a fatal flaw. It allowed the British to retain significant economic control even as they prepared to grant political independence. And this had devastating consequences for India's future.
This is where things take a tragic turn, isn't it? The partition of India.
Yes. Sarkar contends that the British, recognizing the growing anti-colonial sentiment, sought to sow discord as they made their exit. They cleverly exploited the existing fault lines within Indian society, particularly the religious divide between Hindus and Muslims.
So they deliberately played up those differences to weaken the independence movement, a classic divide and conquer strategy.
Precisely. They instilled in the Muslims a fear of Hindu domination, arguing that once the British left, the Hindu majority would inevitably marginalize and oppress them. This tactic, sadly, proved effective.
So a new sentiment was born, a sentiment of fear and distrust among Muslims.
Yes, what Sarkar terms Hinduphobia. And the British, masters of manipulation, knew just how to exploit this sentiment. They presented the partition of India, the creation of a separate Muslim-majority state, Pakistan, as the only solution to ensure the safety and security of Muslims.
It's heartbreaking how fear was used to tear a nation apart. Did the Indian leaders at the time recognize this British ploy? Did they try to counter this divisive narrative?
Sarkar argues they could and should have done more. He criticizes them for failing to proactively cultivate a stronger, unifying sentiment, one focused on shared economic goals and a vision of a prosperous, inclusive India.
So their reactive approach to fighting for independence, their focus on political power over economic empowerment, ultimately left them vulnerable to these divisive tactics.
That's his analysis. He believes that if they had prioritized economic independence, forging a united front against the exploitation of both the British and local elites, they could have fostered a more resilient sense of national unity.
In Sarkar's view, this fight for economic justice would have resonated across religious and regional lines, creating a more solid foundation for a united India.
Exactly. He argues this shared struggle would have diluted religious anxieties and diminished the appeal of the Hindu phobia narrative. It would have made a partitioned India seem unnecessary and even absurd.
It makes you wonder what might have been if they had taken this path, recognizing the unifying power of shared economic aspirations. But sadly, history took a different course. India was partitioned, and those who had fought side by side against the British now found themselves on opposing sides of a newly drawn border. What does Sarkar say about the state of the Indian nation in the aftermath of this traumatic event? So India is independent, but also deeply wounded by partition. What does Sarkar say about the state of the Indian nation at this point? Did that hard-won unity survive?
He paints a pretty bleak picture, actually. The anti-British sentiment, that unifying force during the struggle, it vanished as soon as the colonizers left. It left a void, a lack of shared purpose to bind the newly independent nation together.
So the very glue that held them together during the struggle dissolved once they won.
Yeah. It's kind of tragic.
It is. What filled that void?
All those old divisions resurfaced. Language, region, caste. Sarkar is actually quite critical of the leadership in this period. He says they made some crucial mistakes that further exacerbated these divisions rather than, building on that unity from the independence movement.
What kind of mistakes? Give us the specifics. This feels relevant even today.
He points to the reorganization of states along linguistic lines, which just amplified regional identities kind of at the expense of national unity. He also criticizes the debate over a national language, saying it created unnecessary tension, especially pushing Hindi as the sole official language, which alienated people whose mother tongues were different.
So instead of forging a new unifying sentiment for a newly independent India, they kind of fell back on those very factors language, region that Sarkar had identified as superficial and divisive.
Exactly. It's like they were looking backward instead of forward. He also doesn't like the decision to replace English as the medium of instruction in higher education. He said that hindered communication and interaction among students from different parts of the country, further fragmenting the intellectual and cultural landscape.
Less shared experience, less common ground.
Exactly.
It does sound like a series of missed opportunities to capitalize on that unity from the independence movement. Does Sarkar just leave us with this critique, or does he offer solutions? How does he envision a truly united and strong India emerging from this?
He doesn't just criticize, he offers a roadmap.
Okay.
He calls for a pretty fundamental shift, moving away from those divisive factors like language and region and focusing on shared economic interests.
So instead of states based on linguistic identity, he envisions states organized around economic zones.
Yeah.
That's a bold idea.
Yeah.
Is that even practical?
Well, Sarkar argues that prioritizing economic development, making sure there's equal opportunity and shared prosperity across all regions, that would create a much stronger bond than these artificial linguistic boundaries. He actually goes into a lot of detail about how this could work, and I think it's worth checking out.
What about the language issue? I mean, it feels like every few years there's this debate in India about Hindi, English, and the regional languages. How does he propose navigating that?
He doesn't suggest suppressing local languages or cultures. He actually advocates for equal opportunities for all languages while retaining English as a unifying force.
Okay.
Kind of a practical tool for communication, a bridge connecting people from different linguistic backgrounds. And he draws parallels to ancient India, where Sanskrit served a similarly unifying role alongside all the various regional languages.
So a balance between celebrating diversity and maintaining a common thread. It's delicate, but seems essential for a nation as diverse as India. Anything else in his roadmap for a united India?
Yes. Remember how we talked about the British unifying India against a common enemy?
Yeah.
Well, Sarkar proposes a similar strategy, but this time the enemy is internal exploitation. He calls for a nationwide anti-exploitation campaign, uniting people against poverty and inequality.
So finding a new common enemy, not external like the British, but internal.
Right.
That's powerful. And it makes me think how often our political discourse focuses on dividing lines rather than shared struggles.
Exactly. He believes that uniting people against this common enemy, a shared struggle for economic justice, would foster that sense of shared purpose and solidarity, a sentiment that transcends those superficial differences. It's a call to action that really resonates even today.
This deep dive has given me so much to think about. It's made me realize that true unity comes not from imposed uniformity, but from a shared vision and a collective fight for a better future.
Absolutely. What's fascinating is how relevant Sarkar's warnings about divisive politics and the need for a unifying sentiment remain even today, not just in India, but globally. This deep dive has hopefully equipped you to critically examine the forces shaping nations and to recognize the power of shared purpose in building a more united world. I'd encourage you to delve deeper into Sarkar's economic proposals. They're surprisingly detailed and offer a thought-provoking alternative to our current systems.